Welcome to part 2 of my guide to Columbia Records, and in this video we're going to pick up the story in 1970 on the cusp of the release of Miles Davis's record, Bitches Brew. By the late 1960s, Miles Davis and arguably Thelonious Monk were the only jazz musicians that Columbia seemed to care about. But even Miles's sales were paltry compared to what Columbia was making from rock records. Miles was driving Ferraris, he was living well, he was getting advances based on prospective future sales, but jazz in Columbia was living on borrowed time. None of that is to say that Miles wasn't producing music of incredible artistic value, and he was. I mean, here are some of the records that he was putting out then. Feed to Kilimanjaro, Nefertiti, my personal fave from his early electric period, In a Silent Way, Miles in the Sky, and ESP, and Sorcerer. I don't really have these in chronological order, but I mean, really, this is a great collection of records, but it just wasn't selling. Monk, too, had done some great work in the 60s for Columbia. Monk's Dream, Monk's Blues, Monk's record with perhaps one of the greatest covers of all time, Underground, and another brilliant cover, Monk. So it's not about the quality, it's about changing times. But if anybody knew how to change with the times, it was Miles Davis. And in August 1969, Miles enters the studio with his producer, Teo Macero, his new electric era band that included people like the reed player Benny Maupin, the keyboardists Chick Corea and Joe Zawinul, and possibly some psychotropic substances, although that could just be rumor. And the record they made was largely a spontaneous creation. Miles came in with some ideas. Here's how I want you to play. You might want a solo here. This is the basic theme of the idea or the riff that we're working with. But for the most part, these were extended jams, very long jams. And it fell to Macero to get his splicing scissors out and to define these down into something resembling coherent tracks that would fit on the four sides of a double LP. The music was pretty out there, even compared to the stuff that Miles had been playing on his previous releases, like In a Silent Way. He plays quite a bit, but there's lots of other dominant sounds like Maupin's bass clarinet and Jack DeJohnette's busy drum work, Zawinul's electric piano, and so on. The record is titled Bitches Brew. It comes out in 1970, and compared to anything else that Columbia's jazz division had released in the previous decade, or maybe ever, it is an incredible success. It topped the jazz charts, and more importantly, it went to number 35 on the pop albums charts. It stayed on those charts for 6 months. Eventually it went platinum, and it brought Miles right back into the public eye, having once again changed the sound of contemporary jazz fundamentally. All the more amazing, this record sold truckloads despite being, largely pretty inaccessible, fairly out there avant-garde music. It ranges from the mildly discordant to the, verging on free jazz. Now, when I first heard this record when I was in my 20s, I must confess I was kind of disappointed. I felt that the first three sides in particular were indistinguishable, interminable, kind of pointless noodling. I didn't think it was very funky. I didn't think the record swung at all. I dipped back in over the years, but I felt that in advance of making this video that I should give it a proper listen. So I did, and I can report that now I find it excruciating. The drumming to me sounds like somebody rattling a cutlery drawer. The mix is muddy and soaked in epic levels of reverb. The solos sound like a parody Shreds video on YouTube. However, setting my opinion aside, it's hard to express the impact that this record had on jazz at Columbia Records, and luckily, I have a chart to do just that thing. However, first of all, for context, once again, I want to show you my chart from the previous period, which shows the different kinds of jazz that Columbia released in 1948 until 1970, which is when Bitches Brew was released. And to recall, from this chart, the bottom layer, swing and big band, is dark blue, and then vocal jazz is kind of the forest green layer, which is next, and then bop, and then post-bop, which are in two different shades of blue. So what you might call mainstream jazz in this period from 1948 to 1970, mainstream jazz was a lion's share of output, and most of that was seriously old school music. Now here's the same chart, or at least the same variables, but for a different time period, the 2 decades that followed from 1971 to 1990. Now what can we see from this chart? Well, those formerly dominant styles, big band and swing music and vocal jazz, have almost disappeared entirely. They're just those two bands at the very bottom of the chart. Bop and post-bop, which are the lighter blue bands, they still have a presence, but now what's really driving Columbia as a jazz label is healthy doses of jazz rock fusion, soul jazz, and jazz funk, and those are the categories represented by the brown and the yellow areas. And the pink at the top is smooth jazz, and that starts to appear towards the second half of the 1970s. All of this is a huge change at Columbia, and there's a knock-on effect to the rest of the jazz world as well. And it's not unreasonable to credit Miles Davis for this, because his foresight, his own evolution, and his record, Bitches Brew, goes a long way to create the audience for jazz fusion, jazz rock, and so on, which drove Bitches Brew up the charts and would alter jazz tastes for the next decade. To get a full sense of how radical that was for jazz on Columbia, let's look at the full period from 1948 to 1990. So this is a chart which combines the previous two charts that you've seen here into one long period from 1948 to 1990. And when we look at this chart, we can clearly see, it's screamingly obvious, that 1970 for Columbia Records is an inflection point like no other. From that point on, from the point of release of Bitches Brew, is a total change in the content of what Columbia is putting out and selling. Swing era bands, vocal artists, hard bop, all the traditional elements of a jazz diet in the 50s and 60s, they were now all squarely in the back seat except as retro revivals, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. Instead, what we see from that chart is that Miles's electric work seems to provoke this boom in jazz rock fusion, jazz funk, and related work on Columbia, a lot of which was actually driven not only by Miles but by the alumni of his own groups. This included the fusion work of John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, of which I have few records to show you because it's not really to my taste, but it also includes the magnificent funky work done by Herbie Hancock on Columbia in the 1970s. Not just the legendary record Headhunters, but also his records Secrets, Manchild, and Thrust. It includes the funky self-reinvention of Ramsey Lewis, and it also included the work of two other veterans of Miles's groups, the saxophonist Wayne Shorter and the keyboardist Joe Zawinul, and the group they formed in 1970, Weather Report. And in many ways, Weather Report is kind of a microcosm of the development of jazz at Columbia in the 1970s. It begins kind of as a Bitches Brew tribute act, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but still. Then it evolves into a more of a funk-oriented band, and they start experimenting with more synthesizers eventually you get the virtuoso bass playing and the more complicated arrangements of the Jaco Pastorius era. But then a funny thing happens to jazz in the late 1970s. Much as big rock had become a bloated extravaganza, a festival of self-indulgence, contemporary jazz in the late 1970s had its critics too. And those critics felt that jazz had lost touch with audiences and had abandoned the listenability and the public appeal with which the art form in its greatest days had been closely associated. In the view of some, jazz had been reduced to this elaborate, non-swinging music which was played in small venues for white intellectuals, and a new cohort of musicians, dubbed the New Traditionalists or the Young Lions, wanted jazz to get back to basics. And in this way, oddly enough, despite their buttoned-down appearance, they shared something with the punks in rock and roll, who wanted to get away from all the pretension and get back to three chords and the truth. Now, there are a number of musicians who are associated with this new traditionalist movement, but by far the highest profile is that of the trumpeter Wynton Marsalis. Wynton was from a well-regarded New Orleans jazz family, and he wanted to get back to playing small group acoustic jazz, and he did so. And he was well rewarded both in terms of record sales and in terms of industry prizes. Now, personally, I'm kind of two minds about the neo-traditionalist backlash to what was happening in the 1970s. Now, I completely agree with their indictment of jazz in the late 1970s that basically it had disappeared up its own electric backside. A lot of the stuff which comes out under the banner of jazz fusion later on I find unlistenable in the same way that I can't really sit through a whole Emerson, Lake and Palmer record or two whole albums of Yes. Maybe the best way to put it is that I admire the technical brilliance, but I never find myself humming it. So I get the impulse that Marsalis had, but I also have to say that he was, and this is basically, I think, young man syndrome, not shy about voicing his opinions about people who probably deserved a little more deference, including Miles Davis. He calls Miles a general who has betrayed his country. He says his music is not jazz. Miles, of course, gets his own back by telling Wynton to F off when Wynton climbs onto his stage at Expo 86 in Vancouver. Anyway, regardless of the personalities and regardless of what I think about it, what's true, I think, is that the 1980s saw a decline in jazz fusion and the commercial resurgence of more accessible jazz on Columbia via a number of avenues. The new traditionalists, the smooth jazz of Grover Washington, of Hubert Laws, of Bob James, the retro vocals of Harry Connick Jr., and here's a chart which shows the most prolific jazz artists on Columbia in this later vinyl era from 1971 to 1990. And it's a real mixed bag. What you can say when you look at these artists is that notwithstanding the wave of commercialism and nostalgia, which overwhelmed Columbia's roster in the 1980s, all the way through this period, all the way through the 1970s and 1980s, Columbia was represented by highly contemporary artists, which is not something you could have said about Columbia's catalog in the 1950s and 1960s, when you had a small number of cutting-edge artists existing amidst a sea of mediocrity and dated musical styles. I think what this chart says too is that Columbia was only interested in jazz to the extent that it could cross over and sell. There are very, very few examples of classic jazz being released by Columbia in the 1970s. There's one exception, of course, which is, or at least one, but here's one, Dexter Gordon's wonderful comeback album, Homecoming, I think recorded at the Village Vanguard. This comes out in 1977, but as I say, it's a real rarity. Columbia focused on fusion in the 70s because it made them a ton of cash. Jazz rock fusion albums sold in numbers that straight-ahead jazz rarely had, and Columbia, again, had the distribution network and the resources to push them onto the charts, into the chain stores, and onto radio playlists. Columbia might have had deep pockets, but they had very little interest in jazz voices playing in lofts and small clubs in New York, people like Cecil Taylor or Anthony Braxton or Sun Ra, artists like that who ended up finding homes elsewhere. When fusion falls out of favor in the early 1980s, Columbia embraces traditionalism in the form of the Marsalis brothers and others. Walter Yetnikov, who had taken over the presidency of Columbia Records from Clive Davis, was interested in jazz if it could cross over and make money. And that applied to anybody on the label, even if it was Miles Davis, who had taken a health break for a few years in the late 1970s, and when he came back, his last few albums on Columbia were infused with a lot of, let's just say, pop crossover sentiment. For jazz on Columbia, the 1970s, I think, has to be seen as kind of an ironic decade, because before and after the 1970s, they kind of revert to type. In the 1970s, unusually, Columbia were tastemakers. They weren't tastemakers in jazz before that point, and they weren't tastemakers in jazz after 1980. As I say, the 80s saw a reversion to type. There were some highlights like Arthur Blythe, but in general, interest in jazz in Columbia winds down, and eventually Columbia is bought in 1988 by Sony, which ended up directing Columbia towards the destination it's largely arrived at today, which is one of curation of its impressive and extensive back catalog. So 1990 isn't where the story of jazz on Columbia concludes, but it is where my interest diminishes as a collector of jazz from the original vinyl era, and as Columbia then goes on to lose its essential identity in the corporate soup of takeovers which consumed most music labels by that point. So I'll leave the history there, and I'll move on to the nerdier aspects of collecting jazz on Columbia. So now we come to the part of the guide where I'm going to talk about some really nerdy stuff. Logos, details of labels, and some of the relevant detail regarding catalog numbers for jazz on Columbia. First of all, and maybe I should have done this earlier on, but I want to talk about just how many records we're talking about here. How many jazz records did Columbia release in the period between 1948 and 1990? Well, like all these things, that's a matter of interpretation. If you were to go onto Discogs and you were to look at Columbia and its two main sub-imprints in the LP era, Harmony Records and Epic Records, and you went with how people categorized music on Discogs, you would end up with a figure somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 LPs, closer to 3,000 I would suggest than 2,000. And in saying this, I should just clarify that I'm talking about unique releases, not double counting releases which are both mono and stereo. But if a record comes out, it's only counted once, whether it's in mono or in stereo. The record is only counted once. So again, let's say that figure is something like 2,500. Well, obviously that's unsatisfactory, because if you spend any time on Discogs, you'll know that people tend to be inclusive when they categorize. And so sometimes you'll see a record which is listed as a jazz record, which is patently not a jazz record. It might have one song which is half jazzy or something like that, and somebody has kind of over-egged the pudding. In other words, there's a lot of music on Discogs which is categorized as jazz that I don't think serious jazz collectors are going to be interested in. Examples of this? Well, on Columbia alone, the work of Andrei Kostelanetz, the syrupy band leader, or Florentine teacher, or the Norman Luboff Choir. There are many, many records by these and similar artists, and I would call this stuff, which is typically lush, it's string-soaked, it's syrupy orchestral music, I would call this stuff maybe jazz adjacent, but out of scope for our discussion. And it's a lot of Columbia's catalog. This stuff jams the crates in dollar stores and charity shops. It vies for space with the Nana Muscuri records and the Kate Smith records. I don't think it's jazz, and I'm not going to include it here. But inevitably, this is a question of opinion. There's always a gray area where I'm going to say one thing and people would disagree. So for example, in counting Columbia jazz releases, looking at singers, I've included Frank Sinatra, I've included Barbra Streisand, and I've included Tony Bennett as jazz singers, and other singers I've excluded as basically being pop singers. Your mileage may vary. Anyway, if you watch this channel long enough, hopefully you trust my judgment as to what is jazz and what isn't. And anyway, you're stuck with my judgment because you're watching my video. So have a little faith and let's go forward. Based on what I consider to be jazz, by my count, Columbia, Epic, and Harmony released 1,740 unique jazz LPs between the years 1948 and 1990. 1,740. Of those, 1,238 are on Columbia, 306 are on Epic, and 151 are on Harmony. I should say that I've excluded various artist records, I've excluded compilations, and I've excluded greatest hits. And as I say, I've gotten to a total of 1,740. Now, for perspective, that's about twice as many records as the whole of the Blue Note catalog. It's about twice as many records as the whole of the Prestige catalog. But of course, the Blue Note and Prestige catalogs, jazz-wise, were of much higher quality than Columbia overall. To give you a sense of the relative, we may call density of quality in Columbia versus some other more specialized jazz labels, let me give you a sense from my own collection. I currently have about 2,300 records, of which nearly 1,400 are jazz. And of those 1,400, I have 124 Blue Notes, I have 124 Impulses, and 102 of contemporary records. But I only have 78 Columbia Jazz LPs. And when we consider that Columbia issued more jazz records, even after I've defined jazz down to a harder core, that Columbia issued more jazz records than Blue Note, Impulse, and Contemporary Records, those three labels combined. I have 4.5 times more records from those three independent labels than I have from Columbia. And so the moral of this story is, when it comes to Columbia, you need to be selective about what you pick up. So now let's turn to logos and labels. And Columbia's logos and labels are some of the most talked about and the most famous in the history of recorded music. The very first Columbia logo is the so-called Magic Notes, and the earliest version I could find of any Magic Notes logo is from 1908. Here's an example of that on a record called Happy Heine. I don't think you could make that up. That logo has the Magic Notes, and it also makes reference to prizes won presumably at trade fairs, including ones in Paris, St. Louis, and Milan. And that logo lasts until around 1916, when it's replaced by this one, which incorporates the word Columbia in a circle with the two notes. Now that version of the logo incorporated the slogan, "Note the Notes," and it's replaced in a couple of years, that slogan, by a reference to Columbia's sister company's record player technology, Graphonola. That's a fairly busy version of the logo, and by the mid-1920s, it had been replaced by a more streamlined version, what I would call the classic interwar version of the Magic Notes logo. And that classic version, here it is here, lasts all the way through Columbia's troubles in the 1930s until the CBS buyout. And in 1939, a new logo combines the Magic Notes logo with a CBS microphone. The word Columbia is removed from the logo and simply becomes a large word mark. And that logo stays on Columbia 78s all the way until they're discontinued in 1958. On LPs, the dual Magic Notes microphone logo was used from the very start of the LP in 1948. By 1949, the logo has become tiny and is right at the bottom of the circle. I'll show you, I've got a record from 49, I think it's 49 or 50, Trio Los Panchos, an original Columbia, and you will see that there you can see that the logo, it's very hard to make out that it's actually a logo, but there it is, just at the bottom of the circle, but on the upper part, the Magic Notes on the left-hand side and the microphone on the right. They were also pitching the micro groove technology as well, and that whole design, eventually dropping the micro groove branding, exists until the fundamental redesign of the logo and the introduction of the 6-eye look in 1955. So here is the famous 6-eye label. This is Dave Brubeck Quartet in Europe, and here is the 6-eye label. It includes a new walking eye logo, replacing the Magic Notes, and an even more vivid red, I think, than the red brick color which was used before. As I mentioned, the walking eye is actually supposed to be a stylus on record, which I guess you can kind of see. It looks a lot like an eye, I think, in this first design, less like an eye in later designs. And while there isn't complete consistency around its introduction, this is a record label after all, essentially from 1955 until the early 1960s, that 6-eye look and feel and logo was used on mono releases all the way from 55 to about 1962. And given that modern jazz was really becoming central to Columbia's jazz brand at that point with the signing of Brubeck and Davis, there really is a kind of a before and after the 6-eye label. It's kind of the high water mark of modern jazz on Columbia. Now, stereo makes its appearance on Columbia, unsurprisingly, in 1958, which was very typical of the industry. They were actually beaten to the punch by RCA, who put their first living stereo records out in early 1958. Columbia takes another 4 or 5 months to get theirs to market, even though Columbia had actually been recording actively in stereo since 1955. The first stereo jazz release on Columbia was by Ray Conniff, Soulful Nice, and as was typical, not just of Columbia but other labels, stereo is marketed as this fancy new thing on the front cover. They also differentiated the label for stereo releases. They had the same red and black design and the same 6 eyes, but there was a fancy stereo fidelity word mark at the top, and there was a slightly different ratio of red and black ink. Here are some photographs. I can't actually show you one of mine. This is a bit of a humble brag because I don't actually have any stereos. All of my early Columbias are mono. Note too that all of these pressings are deep groove at this stage. Columbia had a number of different record plants, and all of them essentially phased out deep groove when everybody else did in the early 1960s. You can still find deep groove with regularity to about 1962. By 1964, it's essentially gone. There was then a significant label redesign in 1962. Now, there had been a slight tweak to the label in that a small CBS credit had been added up near the top about a year or so before. But there's then a wholesale change which happens. This is from 1962. And what you see is that the number of walking eyes has been reduced from 6 to 2. You have a new sans serif word mark in white at the top. Again, it's on a red background. The red has remained the same. And if you look closely, they have also changed the eye, replacing the single pupil with several concentric circles inside. Now, for stereo versions from 1962, the word stereo in large black letters is included at the bottom, along with the slogan 360 sound in quotation marks. Now, later on in 1962, they added arrows and the text was changed to white. By 1963, they started phasing out guaranteed high fidelity as the word mark for mono, replacing it with just a large all caps mono at the bottom of the label. They also got rid of the 360 sound tag, which was always a bit weird on a mono record, because how are you going to get 360 sound from a mono recording anyway? Maybe they worried about that, maybe they didn't, but it was disappeared. Mono itself winds up around 1968, which of course was quite typical of the industry, and in a strange coincidence, the very last record on mono on Columbia was by Ray Conniff, just as the very first record on stereo had been by Ray Conniff. One can find some mono releases that come out after 1968, but those are typically promo releases, not the full release. Now, the last great redesign of the Columbia label on vinyl happens in 1970. And for that redesign, they kept a red label, although it's now, I think, a bit of a darker, richer, orangier kind of red. And what you have is now a yellow or golden text around the rim of the label, and they've incorporated the logo. You can see the eye, and it's in between the different Columbias on the perimeter of the label in the circular text. And these labels are sometimes referred to as the one-eye labels. That one-eye label corresponded to a whole new numbering system as well, as they'd come to the end of the 9000s. I'll get to that later when I talk about catalog numbers. That last redesign, the one-eye label with a yellow or golden text around the rim, comes into being in the summer of 1970. The very first pressing of Miles' Bitches Brew actually is on the old Columbia label. That is to say the two-eye, not the one-eye, but his Fillmore record, which comes out in the fall of 1970, is on the new label. In fact, I'm not sure, and I did a fair amount of looking on this, exactly which was the very first jazz record on the new one-eye label. I think a good candidate is a comp by the great classic blues singer Bessie Smith, but I'd be happy to have somebody prove me wrong in the comments. Anyway, from that label redesign in 1970 to the end of vinyl as the dominant means of releasing music in around 1990, Columbia really doesn't change its label significantly again. So now let's talk about catalog numbers. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to catalog numbers on Columbia. First of all, Columbia did not GAF about the difference between pop and jazz and other genres when it came to catalog numbering. There's no specific set of catalog numbers for jazz. There is for classical music, but everything else on Columbia tends to get lumped together. And the second thing to say is that catalog numbering systems for record labels are inherently weird and illogical, and Columbia is no different. They reused numbers, they made strange choices about whole categories of numbers for a particular series, and they would sometimes create a new catalog series for a very small number of releases for some kind of quirky reason. Now, for me to describe all this in minute detail would be boring for you and boring for me, and more to the point, not very useful. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to deal just with broad brush characterizations, and I'm going to dwell very little on the smaller deviations. So let's start with Columbia. Let's start with 10-inch records, and on Columbia, of course, those start in 1948. With some exceptions, 10-inch jazz records on Columbia are on the CL 6000 series, and they range from CL 6001 in 1948 to CL 6338 in 1954. These typically have a red label, and of course they're all mono. Now this is where things start to get a bit weird in Columbia, because the 10-inch era for most record labels ends pretty squarely at the end of 1954. But Columbia, for reasons best known to themselves, kept the 10-inch format going for 2 more years until the end of 1956. They do this despite the fact that they, just like everybody else, have adopted the 12-inch LP as the dominant format for music, jazz or otherwise, a year before in 1955. So you'd think the obvious thing would be for Columbia just to keep on putting out records on 10-inch in the CL 6000 series until they decided to stop making them. But that's not what they did. Instead, they stopped putting them out in the CL 6000 series, and they put them into a new series, the CL 2500 series. Will this come back to bite them? Well, yes, it would. But first of all, let's talk about what they did with 12-inch releases. And there, again, it's not exactly neat and tidy. So in 1953, the CL 500 series begins. Now the CL 500 series, which goes on to go much higher up than 500, but that's the main series for mono LPs on Columbia. It starts, however, not as the CL 500 series, but as the GL 500 series. They've got black labels, and that persists for a little while. It changes to CL 500, with red labels, not black, after a few months. And again, these are all still 10-inch records. In fact, in that GL/CL 500 series in 1953, 1954, there are, I think, 16 10-inch jazz releases and a couple of 12-inch jazz releases, just to confuse things, in that run. So if you're keeping score on 10-inch, you had the CL 6000 series, which then changes to the CL 2500 series in 1955, but you also have a handful of 10-inch records on the GL/CL 500 series. Confused yet? Okay, it's going to get better. Things certainly clarify in 1955 for 12-inch releases, because from that point, from 1955 all the way until 1968, mono releases for jazz records, 12-inch jazz records on Columbia, are on the CL series. The CL 500 series eventually going up to CL 2828, which was the last mono jazz release in 1968. Now there was a problem in there, which some of you may already have figured out or anticipated. As I mentioned, they had chosen to park their residual 10-inch production in the CL 2500 series during the mid-1950s. But by 1966, the CL 500 series, which was the main 12-inch mono release series, had gotten up to the 2500s. But they had already used those catalog numbers previously to put out those kind of leftover 10-inch releases. So what did they do? Well, they reused the numbers. And so you've got about 5 dozen or so, probably more, but certainly quite a few records that have the same catalog number as 10-inch releases in 1955 or 56 and as 12-inch releases, totally different record, totally different artist, in 1966. Here are some examples. CL 2503, which was a 10-inch record by Les Elgart in 1955, is also a 12-inch record by Pete Seeger in 1966. CL 2504, which was a Frankie Laine 10-inch in 1955, was also a Charlie Bird 12-inch in 1966. And CL 2507, which was a Tony Bennett 10-inch record in 1955, becomes an Olatunji record, More Drums of Passion, in 1966. And so on. As I say, I found about 5 dozen examples of this, comparing notes as I went through Discogs. There may be more, I'm not sure. Of course, not all of those affect the jazz catalog. A lot of those were jazz records with the original catalog number on 10-inch, which then became some other kind of record later on in the pop or soul or R&B genres or whatever later on. I apologize to any of you with obsessive compulsive tendencies who've been triggered by this. Exactly why Columbia decided to reuse these numbers as opposed to, say, skipping over the numbers that they already used, only they know, but they did. The good news is it didn't really affect that many records. Now, as we know, stereo arrives in 1958, and with it, obviously, a new cataloging system for stereo records. The mono cataloging series at that time, as we know, began with CL. The stereo cataloging system begins with CS, beginning in 1958. For the most part, until 1968, the number is equivalent to the mono catalog number plus 6,800. So for example, J.J. Johnson's A Touch of Satin from 1961 has a mono catalog number of CL 1737 and a stereo catalog number of CS 8537, a difference of 6,800. But this being a record label's cataloging system, of course it can't be consistent. The X plus 6800 rule regarding the relationship between mono and stereo releases wasn't the case in the early years of stereo. At that time, Columbia would pick an 8000 number for stereo, but it didn't necessarily have a regular relationship with the mono number. So for example, the plus 6800 rule is not true of Time Out, it's not true of Kind of Blue. It's only by the early 1960s that the plus 6800 rule is locked in. When mono was discontinued in 1968, only the stereo releases, the CS series, continued. But they had another problem, which was, as I'd mentioned before, by the late 60s, early 70s, they had gotten to the end of the 9,990s and had to make a decision whether they were going to go into the 5 digits or pick an entirely new series. And what they ended up doing was both. Their new cataloging system, which became a unified system for Columbia releases across the board, was the 30,000 system. Why they didn't pick the 10,000 system, I don't know, but it's the 30,000 system, which begins in the middle of 1970, pretty much coterminous with the new one-eye label design. There are also a raft of odd prefixes to the 30,000 series, including KC, PG, CT, and a whole bunch of others, which frankly I don't think are really worth our time deciphering. If you're a collector, here's the big picture. The CL500 series is the essential series for mono jazz LPs from 1955 until the end of mono in 1968. The CS8000 series is the series for jazz stereo 12-inch releases from 1958 until 1970. And the 30,000 series is the main catch-all series on Columbia for all LPs from 1970 onwards. As for 10-inch LPs, as I mentioned, they appear on 3 different series, and they don't appear, for jazz anyway, after 1956. Now, a few words about the Columbia sub-imprint Harmony Records. Now, it had been a budget label, a sub-imprint, used by Columbia in the 78 era, and it resurfaces in the LP era beginning in 1957, and it's used essentially for reissues and compilations. Only a minority of its releases were original material. Harmony LPs originally had a 7 circles design on a burgundy label with a slightly different version on the front cover of the record. Here's an example from 1957, Pete Rugelow's New Sounds. The catalog series for mono records on Harmony was the HL7000 series, and again, there's no distinction on Harmony, as there had not been on Columbia, between genres. So you get pop and jazz and all other kinds of genres on the HL7000 series. Stereo arrives for Harmony in 1958, as it does for other labels, and the stereo series on Harmony is the HS11000 series. By 1959, Harmony has a bit of a different look. They'd switched to a black label for both mono and stereo releases, and the stereo design has a big fancy stereo wordmark at the top with arrows. Somewhere in 1964, there's then a very significant label redesign, but only for stereo. The label is now brown, and the Harmony logo has been fundamentally changed. It's now this kind of bisected H. As I say, that was only for stereo. The mono labels continue through the 60s as they had looked in the late 50s. Eventually, mono was discontinued in 1968, as it had been on Columbia, and at that point there's no significant change to the stereo label. The only other change of note for Harmony is that in 1970, it too adopts the 30,000 series approach, as Columbia had. The Harmony records had a KH prefix to the 30,000 series, and soon after, I think by 1973, Harmony is basically wound up as a going concern. And now Epic Records, and Epic is a heck of a lot more important than Harmony, as I mentioned before, because there was a much more significant quantity of good jazz, interesting cutting-edge jazz released on Epic. And I'll say a bit more about Epic here, as I think I kind of glossed over it before. I talked about some of the great early recordings on Epic by, for instance, Ray Bryant, by Horace Silver, Al Cohn, Ahmad Jamal, Kenny Clarke, Phil Woods, Herbie Mann, Art Blakey, and Curtis Fuller. Those names should tell you that in the 1950s up until the early 1960s, Epic was putting out music which, pound for pound, given the size of Epic as a sub-imprint, was probably better than what was coming out on the parent label Columbia. The 70s were also a really good time for jazz on Epic, and there was some really righteous fusion which ended up on there, including some great records by the bassist Stanley Clarke and Jeff Beck's great crossover fusion records. So here they are. Well, there's a couple of them anyway. Blow by Blow and Wired. These, in my view, are some of the greatest ever releases on Epic. In 1953, Epic began life with the LG series. It would have a 1000 series number if it were a 10-inch record, and a 3000 series number on the rare occasion that it was a 12-inch record in those early years. By 1955, the 12-inch had become standard at Epic, as it had elsewhere. They kept the 3000 series for 12-inch records, which of course became the standard, and there were a few vestigial 10-inch records, and they kept those in the 1000 series. The original Epic labels in 1953-54 looked like this, kind of a black and yellow radial design. By 1955, as you can see here, the slogan, "A product of CBS," had been added below the wordmark. And when stereo arrives in 1958, stereo releases are issued on the BN500 series with Stereorama marketing on the label. Otherwise, they kept the same color scheme and basic black and yellow radial design as the mono LN 3000 series. Now in 1960, Epic engages in a bit of a branding exercise, creating two new series and calling them the Jazz series. These were the LA 10,000 series and the BA 10,000 series. The confusing thing was these weren't the only series on which Epic was releasing jazz. Here's an example. This is that Horace Silver record I showed you before. It's branded as being in the Jazz series, whatever that means. The labels, however, pretty much stayed the same. They had the same black and yellow design as they'd had before, and as the LN series still had going forward. In 1962, the radial design was significantly altered, a couple times actually. The first redesign has the word epic, replacing those radial, whatever they are, strokes or what have you around the rim. Instead you've got epic going around the rim. The BN series, the stereo series, now had the word epic alternating with stereo. But again, both labels retain the same black and yellow color scheme. But that didn't last long, because in the second half of 1963, the labels are changed again, kind of simplified, maybe to go more in line with Columbia's general simplified look in the early 1960s. And so gone is any of the perimeter stuff, and what you get is a small stylized epic word mark with a number of different radial strokes or bands surrounding it in the midst of a plain yellow label. Stereo was added as appropriate, and this label stays pretty much undisturbed for about a decade. Mono finishes up for Epic in 1968, unsurprisingly, and in 1970, you guessed it, Epic also adopts the 30,000 labeling system, which had been applied at Columbia and also at Harmony. The Epic catalog series had the prefix E. In 1973, you get a radical redesign of the label and of the logo. Yellow's gone, in comes orange, I guess it was the 1970s, and in comes a series of white concentric circles. The logo is also completely redone, and you get this new logo known as the Big E. And if it was a quadraphonic record, you got a gold label. In late 78 or early 1979, there's another major redesign of the Epic label, and now you've got a stylized, scripted Epic wordmark on top of a dark background. Sometimes it was in color, sometimes not. And that lasts until the end of the period I'm analyzing in 1990. As with Columbia, when we move into the 70s with Epic, you've got the 30,000 series. It was the E 30,000 series, but they had a whole bunch of other wacky prefixes at different points. What matters is it was the 30,000 series, and eventually that becomes the 40,000 series with the passage of time. So as I wrap this video up, I'd like to offer a small number of tips, guiding suggestions, call them what you want, to new collectors of Columbia records, of Epic records, or even of Harmony records, although I don't know why anybody would collect Harmony records, but I'm sure somebody does. Anyway, here are my tips. The first tip to keep in mind is that just because it's a Columbia jazz record doesn't mean it's a good record. Music which appeared on Columbia because it was commercially viable at the time in the department stores where Columbia was selling records. It meant that it was music which was mass marketed in a way that other labels couldn't manage. Though this may be difficult to believe, it's possible to get consumers to buy almost anything which is conveniently available of middling quality. Now, the second thing to remember is kind of the flip side of that. Despite all of this middling quality, when Columbia got serious about producing a jazz musician and marketing that jazz musician, it produced some of the greatest records in jazz history. Between the mid-1950s and the early 1960s, again in the 1970s, and arguably even in the early 1980s, Columbia artists were at the forefront of jazz. There were always a few giants at Columbia, wading as they were through a sea of mediocrity. The third tip I would offer, this one being specific to Columbia, is keep your eye out for 6i labels. I previously told you that just because it's a Columbia record doesn't mean it's a good record, but if it's a Columbia 6i record, there's a very good chance it's probably worth snapping up. Buy first and ask questions later. Because while the parallel isn't exact, the 6i logo and label largely coincides with the greatest period in Columbia's history. The fourth thing to remember when you're thinking about the label as a whole is that the history of Columbia really is before Bitches Brew and after Bitches Brew. Between 1948 and 1970, Columbia was a highly conservative label on which a few great stars of bop, cool jazz, and modal jazz existed. In 1970, Miles Davis's Bitches Brew saved jazz from disappearing on Columbia entirely. Columbia then became a leading light in jazz fusion and jazz funk for a decade, before eventually settling into neo-traditionalism, smooth jazz, and catalog mining, and that latter categorization is essentially the label which Sony bought and has maintained. My final tip is don't sleep on Epic Records. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. Epic is no true rival to Blue Note or Prestige, but Epic has a much stronger catalog pound for pound than its parent label Columbia. In that way, it's more equivalent, I guess, to a label like Bethlehem in the late 1950s. So there we have it. That concludes my label guide for Columbia Records and for its subsidiary labels, Harmony and Epic. I hope you enjoyed this. As always, I invite you to leave your comments, corrections, suggestions, what have you, in the comment section below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.